100,000, which leaves the rest of the millions. It leaves the rest of the millions like ignored. You know, it's rare that people actually put the name on it and go, yeah, no, it's just us. And you know, we know the bigotries. We don't. I'm sure they've been discussed all day, so I don't need to rehearse them. So, in my view, queering hair is identifying and embracing and amplifying the parts of her work, the queerness, but also the exclusion and the non-normativity that absolutely does exist in her work. And obviously taking her sandbox and playing in it, which I think is a thing that we all do and we all love to do. But I think it's valuable both to acknowledge that she was an incredibly exclusionary person, and that also what you might call her writer brain was a great deal more interesting than her sort of conscious brain. You can, and there's, I want to come back to this, but you can really see how her writing instincts are actually fighting against her conscious instincts in a lot of the time. So I think really when we're queering hair, we're only doing what, you know, she actually laid the groundwork for.
I was thinking about this. Somebody at the end of the last session that right after I joined, started talking about Jane Austen in terms of like a sense of conservatism. And one thing that's always struck me about Austen, and that I think is also very true about Heyer, is that only a certain type of character is allowed to change and transform. That like a lot of Austen's secondaries are very fixed, and that like self-awareness and revelation and transformation is only really possible for like the nuanced, complex leads. Like you'll never see Mrs. Bennet kind of having a revelation about maybe she should change some things. And I feel like Heyer does the same thing. And granted, my most recent Heyer reading is The Black Moth for today's panel, which is everybody's fixed. Nobody changes like ever. Like, but I know that that's true of like from my past readings of some of her work. The ones I'm most familiar with are Devil's Cub and Sylvester, which I devoured at way too formative an age. But this sense that for me, one of the important things about queering Heyer and writers who write in a similar vein is giving that sense of potential to the secondary characters, to the forgotten characters, and even to the leads in ways that those authors might not have anticipated. That something about breaking down those structures, it's a very gentle demolition of the walls that are holding them back from being, you know, better and happier people.
I would add to that, like, when I enjoy something that I recognize as deeply problematic, I kind of want to pick it apart and figure out what I'm enjoying there. Like, it's because I don't think I read Heyer until I was almost 30. Okay. So like I was very, like, it was not formative reading for me. Like I was very aware from the beginning that I'm reading something deeply troubling, you know, and that I'm loving it anyway. So when that happens, whether it's with a book or a movie or anything, I kind of want to pick apart what exactly it is that I'm enjoying there. Like what is making it work? Like I want to take the whole clock apart and see all of the little mechanisms. And then I want to put them back together in a different way, you know, like that's what I want. Like that's what I want to do when I'm both reading Heyer and then when I'm writing something that I know is on the evolutionary tree with Heyer, you know. I want to look at the classism, I want to look at the heteronormativity, and I want to take it down to like the component parts.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to add anything, Rose, or you're muted.
Am I still muted?
No,
No,
you're
not
good.
anymore.
Okay, like Zoom is just glitching like crazy, so I apologize if I suddenly drop out. But I just can't, like I can hear, but I can't really, like the display is weird. I also think like there's a lot of things with Heyer where it's like pretty uncomplicatedly like she is like classist, like she is anti-Semitic, like she is racist, but I like don't like, there is like stuff in her books that is homophobic, but I do think there are also a lot of like intentionally queer characters in her books, like including Tracy and Frank. Obviously, it's not an unproblematic portrayal, you know, in part, like as Angela talked about in her presentation, like part of Tracy's bisexuality, like Tracy's bisexuality is part of his diabolical character, right? Like he's a predatory bisexual. But I do find that in certain like mainstream discussions of hair that those elements also get erased. It's like what with Austen as well, like people talk about how there's nothing political in Austen's books, but that's only true to a certain extent. Like to an extent, like she's not a very political writer, but I mean, people are like, oh, she never mentioned the war. And then it's like, there is the militia everywhere. And there's like the Navy, and there's like people, you know, like I don't fully always understand that critique. And I think sometimes it comes from when people read, they filter out things that they either don't expect to find, or don't know how to process, or don't know how to fit into the rest of the story, or don't know how to fit into their image of what they imagine the author as being like. And so I think it's also important to me, as much as I want to critique hair, to like also point out the queerness that already exists like in her writing that gets denied and overlooked quite a lot.
Speaking of, I feel like it's a good segue to a bit of a discussion of the Black Moth, which is obviously our conference theme. And oh, Rose got ejected. But to what extent you think sort of it opens itself up to queer readings?
Well, the romanticism of male friendship in this book is like wildly off the charts. like the number of times a man like offered to give up his whole life to follow another man somewhere else, like I lost count. And it was, I mean, it's very charming. I think it's one of the most charming things of the whole book is how much Miles is into Jack and how much Frank is into Tracy, despite Tracy's whole thing. And even Tracy, like his little miffed, like, well, I guess I like you, okay. It was just like an absolute high point. And it's, well,
actually, and Jim, which is a really interesting one because of the cross-class element of it.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, Jim and Jack have clearly the closest and most affectionate and tender relationship with their little snits and so on. You know, it's, and you know, Jack wouldn't contemplate having another valet, although he's an earl, and Jim is obviously a complete incompetent. You know, that's you know, there's some remarkable quotes from that relationship. It's the healthiest relationship in the book, let's be honest.
Jim doesn't have a good color sense, but I debate that he is incompetent. Clearly he's like packing things, right? Like he takes good care of the clothes, even if like his color sense is not up to Jack's personal standard.
He didn't load the
You're a Jim fan.
That was Rose's voice, right? From the ether.
Can you not see me?
I can't see you. Maybe it's just me. Oh, there, I've got you, Rose. I've got you. I'm going to pin you again. Sorry. I was like, Rose has come back from the grave to say to defend Jim.
Kanahara.
And then obviously it's full of those relationships, and it's full of I mean, I've got to say, I was going through looking for quotes, and I came across the part where Jack is recovering from his bullet wound, and one of the people caring for him actually says, "And a nice fright you have given us, what with nearly dying and raving about your dicks," which I just thought is a quote and a half. I don't personally feel this is nearly Hayer's most interesting queer work. If we compare it to Powder and Patch in particular, or The Masqueraders, or also These Old Shades, which is like a rewriting of this book, but far more interestingly. It feels like it's, but it does definitely have the themes that she was coming to try out, and in particular with Tracy, the very terrifying yet effete, yet terrifying, beautifully dressed, sneery, you know, formative, absolutely formative for me, character. so yes, I think I regard this very much as a sort of starter book for her, which has a lot of the elements that she was going to take a great deal more pleasure in playing with before then she got scared and stopped playing with them in part of her progression, which is, I think, a really interesting thing when you look at her work as a whole.
I agree. Like, I think if you look, despite the like, sometimes like it's interesting because she's like very concerned in the Black Moth to point out like that some of the dandies are effeminate, right? And they lisp and they this, that. But like, then a way, like clearly she really digs, like part of why she's setting it in this time period is so that she can have foppish men. And like, she loves it. Like she cannot describe an outfit lovingly enough.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, every piece of embroidery.
And these men who absolutely care about their opinion, their appearance, and they're in no way, like Jack is in no way less a hero for caring this much to the point of obsession about his incredibly elaborate bright coloured clothing. And you know, she's rolling with that. She's absolutely rolling with that. So yeah, I think that's, you know, it's actually noticeable if you look at her work as a whole again, that she actually moves from this Georgian, lovely, lavish, exceedingly bisexual sort of characters, and she moves towards a very Brummelish, extremely, you know, you've got to wear the plainest possible clothes and be as masculine as possible heroes. And it's
well, even then they're still really finicky about it, right? Like
they
it's
are
all
finicky,
about tailoring.
But you actually really see, I actually looked up the dates of the queerest books she wrote, and she basically, the last one where you've got a hero who's played with is 1940, and the last one where you've got a really strong gay character is 1946, and she kept writing until 1970. And if you compare the later stuff to Powder and Patch, which is 1923, which is also a book I really want to talk about in this context, if you can, you know, between 1903 and 1970, the heteronormativity becomes overwhelming, not to say stifling. But it's really, you can really sit, you could plot it on a graph. Her turning away from, you know, fluidity and color and excitement and any playing with heterosexuality whatsoever.
Yeah, I don't know, like, can we divorce that like from the time period? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like the 20s and 30s as a whole, right, are much more colorful and bisexual in terms of their like aesthetic and like
I think you're right.
What you can do in movies, right? Like the Hays Code, like in the US, the Hays Code comes in, there's the war, like the 50s are obviously like very so yeah.
Right.
No, I think you're absolutely right. She's responding to what's around her. She's not just, you know, she's not just writing. We all know, all of us who write historical fiction, we're writing to respond to our society, aren't we? So,
I mean, you guys have mentioned some other books that you consider to be particularly queer examples of hair, and I feel the desire to talk about those books. So do feel free to leap in with some ideas and thoughts.
Please, can I talk about Powder and Patch, please? Because I think it's the most fascinating book she wrote from a lot of perspectives. So I don't know if anyone's read it, and in many respects it's crap. You know, it's her second book. Black Moth we know isn't very good. Powder and Patch. So basically, just quick overview for those who haven't read it. So it starts with Philip Jetton, who is this absolute toxic masculine Burke. He's got no manners. He's a complete klutz. He's a clumsy rustic. He basically demands the girl Cleone marries him, and she's just like, get away from me, you mannerless gonk. And even his father is fed up of him, because he is basically, all he does is lumber around drinking and fighting like some kind of Shakespearean fool. And he is sent off to Paris to get polish. And what he basically is, you know, he's taught to behave in this very you know, queer, frankly, way. He is you know, he gets polish, he gets poise, he writes poetry, he learns to flirt, he waves a fan around. There's a really fascinating scene where he like resists, but you know, he's told he has to wear makeup, and he's like, he's resisting and saying, please don't put makeup on me, and then he gives in. And the the actual story of this is how, as a human being and a lover and a son and a friend and everything, he becomes a far better person when he discards the heteronormativity and embraces his new self. And I'm going to quote, "Something inside him has blossomed. Philip is now pure joy." And you see him as, and then the entire second half of the book is Hare desperately pushing back against what she's done. So she's going, "Oh, but he looks like a painted puppet, but he's not really. And he's absolutely as strong and manly as he ever was." And, you know, desperately trying to prove that he's still a sort of super hetero manly hero who wins the heroine. But actually what the book says is that discarding this sort of very lump and boring men only wear dark clothes and, you know, men have no manners, you know, the kind of, you know, man in a hoodie masculinity that we see a lot of, discarding that is actually what makes him eligible to become a hero. So I think, but you know, but she puts that there, and then she obviously is really uncomfortable with it, and the whole book is her fighting back and forth with Philip as heteronormative, non-heteronormative.
I also want to be like, retain some skepticism of authors denying subversive elements in their fiction, taking that at face value. Like, I'm sure there is an extent to which Hare is uncomfortable, but there's also the extent to which Hare is conscious that people are going to be reading the book and reacting to it. And so like, if she says like, "Oh, but he's actually like really manly," like that may also be preempting criticism, right? Like in my early books, I was told to do that by my editor. So
no, I'm sure she had to, but it is actually worth reading for it, because it's like it's full of internal contradictions where she, you know, it's a real push-pull book. It's one of the things that she, you know, in the Masqueraders, she really leans in to the queerness of it, and then we stopped getting that with the Corinthian, where she's playing with the theme of the hero, everyone thinking that he's run away with a boy, and in fact he's run away with a girl. But you know, there's no question on the hero's mind that he knows she's a girl instantly. So you know, it's different levels of playing with what she's doing, and she is, I think, shying away from the embrace of non-heteronormativity that we see in the early books.
But even that, but like the Corinthian literally ends with like the people from the stagecoach or whatever. Like,
it totally
like,
does.
"Oh my God, men are kissing."
Okay,
So...
but the Corinthian is fascinating for this, because you know, you've got all of this throughout the whole book. It's all about you getting this, you know, the audience is getting the thrill that everyone thinks Richard's run away with the boy, and yeah, he's blackmailed for it. It's almost very nearly explicit on page that, you know, Beverly Brandon, the blackmailer, says, "You know, I know why you came to this secluded locality." And people, you know, it's really on page that people think he's run away, and to the end where he's like kissing a boy in public, only it's, you know, but there's absolutely no question in the relationship. It's not in These Old Shades or the Masqueraders where the hero falls in love with the young man who actually turns out to be a woman. In the Corinthian, there is no question of that from the beginning. He, like, the first minute he sets eyes on her, he says, "You're a girl." So they take out that element of it. So she's enjoying herself with other people's perceptions, but the hero, there's no flexing in the hero's identity. Do you see what I mean?
No, I don't know. I think I might disagree with your readings, I guess, of the other books, because in These Old Shades, he figures out she's a girl like immediately. Like the first thing he does is make her take a bath and realizes she's got boobs.
Not in the end, but there's also a thing in the Masqueraders where so Anthony sort of says, "Oh, I started to work out that I started to suspect you were a girl when I started falling in love with you," effectively, which is like, okay, but you were falling in love with him, her, not knowing their gender, kind of thing. So I think there's more flexibility in the earlier books, and the Corinthian is the one where the Corinthian's a bit of a turning point, I think, for her in what she was able to, or interested in, or not scared of writing.
I'm just going to draw in as well, Olivia and Kat. I don't know if you've got anything to add. No, that's all. It's been fascinating, but if you've got anything to add or jump in on.
Well, I have not read nearly as much Hare, limited by the offerings of my public library as a kid. But what I did read a lot of was Baroness Orczy, and this ambivalence between like flamboyant queer flirtation and obsession versus like the manly, like upright heroism stuff is extremely Percy Blakeney from The Scarlet Pimpernel. and which is contemporaneous to a lot of Heyer's work, like in that same time period. And it's always been so interesting to me because the idea of Percy being like the idea that Percy's aristocratic presentation is as much a disguise as anything he does when he's off rescuing aristocrats in Paris. But the idea of Powder and Patch about Jack being sent to Paris to get polish and then getting like too foppish and having to rein it back is a little bit, it feels ambivalent to me in the same way that we're supposed to feel ambivalent about Percy's whole, like, he's literally in disguise to most of his friends and acquaintances, like all the time, to protect these other moments when he's also in disguise somehow. And a lot of it involves drag and dressing like an old French peasant woman. And like, how much of this is camp and how much of this is resistance to the kind of heteronormative categories that were becoming more fixed as time went on?
I'd add that, like, as a hypothesis, right? Like when she pulls away from like sexual fluidity and starts to commit to like men are manly and wear boring clothing, like that's around the time that she becomes also committed to like political conservatism. And it's also at a time when political conservatism starts to, or when politics in general start to recognize gay rights as a thing that could theoretically exist, right? So you have conservatives aligning themselves against this. And so like that might be something that that might be something that could have been in the background authorially. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's difficult to sort of plot the transition in certain ways against sort of what's happening historically versus what's happening in literature as well, and these different influences, I think, isn't it? There's been some good recommendations in the chat as well of people's favorite queer pairings in hair, but a lot of love for Jill and Ferdy, it turns out.
Jill is a really interesting character because, you know, he's because she did write these wonderfully non-toxically masculine characters. You know, we have a lot of the, you know, Regency Buck is absolutely my least favorite Heyer because it's got the super masculine hero who's just like, please somebody shoot him and bury him in the shallow grave. I mean, awful. But Freddie and the Corinthian, not the Corinthian, Cotillion, Freddie and Cotillion, and, you know, the characters in the Foundling, who are completely unconcerned with being masculine. They're concerned with being polite. They're concerned with being well dressed. They're concerned with manners. They're not, you know, they do have these wonderful romances, but they're super queer coded. Because, you know, they're not in this sort of awful bullying version of masculinity that is the heteronormatively typed one. So I think she put an awful lot into that kind of character.
Do you think there's a connection between kind of this increasingly rigid masculinity in Heyer and the way that Regency kind of comes to take over a lot of other historical archetypes, like say medieval or even the Georgian, that part of that is like Regency looks more, quote, traditionally masculine. And so it's able to appeal to the same demographics that are concerned about policing gender norms in, like, you know, 20th century.
That's really interesting.
It's also a lot cheaper to do the BBC dramas, right? Like the
Yeah.
like if you look at like the right, like you get like you have like the Dangerous Liaisons and like the Scarlet Pimpernel, right? And they're all like very expensive. And then it's like you have Pride and Prejudice, and like that is like huge and explodes. And I also think like that is kind of also where you see Regency start to eat the other subgenres, right? I don't know, just a thought.
I'm totally willing to blame all of that on Georgette Heyer. Like I've been wondering for years, like why it has to all be Regency. And if I can hang that on her tomb, like let's do it.
Speaking for myself, I find that Regency is really easy because you've just got just enough modernity that it's not, you know, I've never written a medieval because I'm really distressed that nobody can have a bath. And I think it's just that much, you know, we've got just that little much, you know, you've got the city, you've got transport. So I think it's actually quite a sweet spot from that perspective, between, well, you're still historical, but you've got just enough trappings of modernity to make life bearable.
That's a fair one. I think it was really interesting how you're talking about the different types of heroes and how actually quite a lot of Hare's heroes, even sort of later on, resist sort of some aspects of a more perhaps a particular form of kind of heteronormative masculinity. And this is a sort of broad question, thinking about both that and more broadly, what do you think of the legacy of Hare in terms of queer Regency fiction?
Oh, I think it leaves out a lot of women, for one thing. Like, Hare's heroines are always kind of so isolated. Like, and granted, this is a lot of the Black Moth, but even when you get like sisters, there's always like a conflict between the sisters. And it's, yeah.
She didn't enjoy writing women. I mean, I think she actually said that at one point. I think she actually said that at one point. She's much more interested in writing men. And there's a few of, I can't off the top of my head think of a really strong female friendship in Hare. No, I can't off the top of my head at all, which is kind of striking because she's written some very good male friendships. But there's a lot of older woman, younger woman, sort of aunt
yeah, the auntly relationships are really interesting.
Yeah.
And maybe I was thinking about this. We were watching North and South for the first time last night, and there's a scene in the miniseries where like a servant character is talking about the first time she saw the mistress of the house, and it's like super romantic. Like, she wrapped my hurt finger with her own handkerchief and then later came back to change it, and she was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I would follow her anywhere. And I'm like, I could write an entire novel about this. And it struck me that like we don't really see things like that in Hare. Like, you get the auntly relationships, but it's kind of under this, well, of course women are maternal and nurturing and we don't have to think about it or enjoy it.
There's no servant heroine relationship. Like, I mean, in Venetia, you've got Damarel and his valet, and we hardly see anything of the valet, but I'm sure there must be a million bits of fan fiction, because what's etched in about 5 lines is this wonderful relationship of trust and love and like a lifelong loyalty kind of thing. But I can't think of any of that. You know, there's no
Bath Tangle. I think Bath Tangle might be the only one. You have.
Oh, you see, I hate that one, so I've never.
It's a terrible book.
Horrible book. Horrible. I hate both the hero and the heroine. They deserve.
They're
each
all
other.
horrible. They're horrible people. But you have the heroine and her mother-in-law, who is younger than her, do seem to have something like a friendship. But also the heroine.
Right, yeah.
They lived together because they had to run off to Bath in order to mourn stylishly, you know, but clearly the heroine thinks that her mother-in-law is an idiot. Okay. Yeah. But there's some affection there. Like, there's actual affection between the two characters, you know. That's literally the only example I can come up with.
Yeah. No, she
out of like what, like 50 books? Like, that's it.
Well,
yeah.
It might also be partly our own failure of like recollection. Like, I'm sure there are some, right? I mean, I agree that like she definitely is more interested in the dudes, but like even in this book, like there's Aunt Betty, who's like awesome. Like Molly and Diana hang out and like Molly talks a lot about how beautiful Diana is. Like, you know, like there is like interaction between the female characters. Like
it's not, it doesn't come across the same way though, does it? It doesn't have the same heart. You know, Molly's a great character, but I don't, for me, the Molly and Diana relationship was just sort of there to show what great, that they were both great kind of thing. It doesn't come across as the sort of in-depth.
They don't get an adventure of their own.
They don't get an adventure. And you don't think that, you don't really imagine them going off on an adventure either, do you?
Do they even get dialogue? I'm not sure they have dialogue.
No, I don't think they do.
I think there's a contrast, isn't there? And this is particularly because whenever I have conversations with people who are resisting queer readings of Hare or queer possibilities, the go-to is always homosocial bonds and how all of these men, they're just exploring homosocial bonds, but the extremity and kind of interest in male friendship and male relationships isn't quite echoed in the female relationships, I don't think, is it? Even if we do find some friends. But there's a really interesting point been brought up by Angela in the chat, so I'll just sort of highlight that for us. So Angela's asking if we can talk about the relationship of masculinity and femininity, and specifically how her heteronormative masculinity and gender fluidity are both femphobic or deeply femphobic, because it seems to me that a lot of the heroines reject femininity as frivolous, and that it only becomes acceptable when mediated through a particular kind of class-based aristocratic masculinity.
That's the Grand Sophie, right? Like that's the entire Grand Sophie, is that she can shoot a gun, and like she can, like, her primary relationships are with men, like her dad and the forgettable love interest, like that's, and she's probably one of Hare's greatest heroines, right? Like she's, for all of the nightmare that book is, like she has so much personality, but all of her friendships, all of her relationships are with men and with animals.
Hare doesn't like super feminine women, certainly not at the center. I mean, Lavinia is just such a horrifying misogynist caricature. I hope we can all hate Lavinia, because really,
I don't hate Lavinia.
Do we not hate Lavinia?
I really want to write
Lavinia.
I don't hate Lavinia.
I want to write her as a heroine
Lavinia
so bad. I want to write a
love
messy Lavinia so badly.
Please write
She's
Lavinia
just
decently,
Tracy.
then.
Like she's Tracy, but like a girl. Like
they just don't give her the pass.
Exactly.
But Tracy's got determination. Lavinia's a moron. I mean,
Lavinia is so. Are you kidding? Lavinia has been like. Lavinia control. Like Lavinia has definitely got, like, she runs her household with a fist of iron.
And loses though. I mean, no, I'm not going to be pro Lavinia here. I really abominate Lavinia, but I can't actually remember.
But it's not an objective position, right? Like, but I agree that she's a misogynist caricature, but like.
But we were starting off on the super feminine thing, and I think I was actually wanted to raise Regency Buck here, because that is one of the most caricatured masculine feminine books that Hare did. Because on the one hand, you've got Worth, I mean, oh my god, the name, who is, Superman with his breeches and his thighs and his manliness, telling everyone what to do. And you've got Judith, on the other hand, who wants to be a Grand Sophie type heroine and hates the fact that she's conventionally beautiful in an extremely white cishet way, with, she's got golden curls and big blue eyes, and she looks like a shepherdess kind of thing, and everyone takes the mickey out of her. And she despises herself for being a very beautiful woman in a girlish kind of way. She hates that, and she actually goes off and she learns to take snuff to look more like a man and be more acceptable. And she drives her carriage to be more manly about it. And that, I think the fact that she's a character who ought to be sort of rejoicing in herself, and she actually despises all the femininity that she's got, is really striking. And then I thought one of the really interesting things about Regency Buck, though, is that at one point she disgraces herself because she's Superman's, and she goes on a carriage race, and she's disgraced because it's going too far and women shouldn't do that. And then she meets up with Beau Brummel, who tells her effectively, if you're in disgrace for driving your carriage, you need to get out there and drive your carriage twice as much. Be you, do you, but even harder. And that's how she regains her position, which is, in some respects, quite a queer way of looking at things, isn't it? It's just saying, I am me, and I'm going to be me twice as hard, and that's how she wins. But it's very much Brummel, the fashionista, telling her to lean into this masculinity.
Yeah, I do feel like what we're seeing is both like Hare's own desire to be like the cool girl, right? And then also like
not
Hare's
like
own
girls.
Sexual type. Like Hare is clearly into like androgyny, right? Like she likes the butch women and the like femme men.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah. There's lots of questions, so I'm just going to have the one sort of last rounding up question for our panel discussion, and then I'll open it up to our kindly question gatherers to tell us some of the audience questions. But what does it mean? So I'm combining questions 4 and 5 if you have your question sheets in front of you guys, but what does it mean for you as writers to write a queer Regency, and how do you queer hair world? So kind of what's been the influence of hair in some ways, both in terms of something to push against and something that's maybe in influencer writing in some ways. So what does it mean for you to write a queer Regency? What are some of the challenges of that, and what does it mean for you to queer hair world? So any of you jump in.
I think for me, a lot of it was finding that same sense of playfulness and sumptuousness in something that wasn't quite so imperial and colonial and aristocratic. Like, you know, I love clothing descriptions. I can read clothing descriptions all day and be super happy about it. But finding other places to put that kind of like sense of luxury, like in the second book in the Feminine Pursuits series, it's all about the gardens, and it's about, there's kitchen gardens and there's luxury gardens and pleasure gardens, but there's also like meadows and wildlands, and getting that same kind of lushness in something that wasn't, you know, specifically or quite so openly. Well, we can go into the whole enclosures problem, but let's not. But finding sites of getting that same sense of brio was really important to me, because I think the sparkliness of hire is what I want to take away with it. I want people to feel transported and breathless, and she does that so well when she's really on form. And so for me, like locating that in other places, like in work and in jobs and in even like lower class, like industrial jobs, finding that sense of wonder is really important for me.
And I agree with that. And I also, I mean, I love Hayer's work. I mean, there's books that I have read like a dozen times. I could literally hold these up and they're falling apart in my hands. I read them dozens and dozens of times as a teenager. And for me, queering hair is simply taking all the brilliant things she did, which people have been using tropes, and just opening them out and making, you know, pushing the size of the sandbox away to make it bigger. You know, I want to write The Reluctant Widow with Frances Cheviot, who is actually its hero. I wrote an entire blog post on this. Frances Cheviot, the apparent villain, is the hero of that book, not the apparent hero and heroine. And I want to write that book as soon as it's out of copyright with the heroic queer spy. I want someone to do the trans version of The Masqueraders, because it's begging. Oh my God, it's begging for that to happen. And I think that I've taken so much joy from Georgette Hare in my life, and I want to spread the joy, but I just want to spread it more fairly.
There's been a lot of love for the Frances and Louis storyline, even though obviously it ends in a murder.
Well, I've literally written an entire blog post explaining why he's the hero of that book. So, you know, I would I feel very strongly on this subject.
It's one of the worst things for me about, I mean, out of a bag of bad things about the film adaptation, where it makes him very, very het, and it makes him
one
the villain.
could do that. He's spectacularly gay, and you know, and the hero, and she goes for it and she loves it. But that's pretty much the last hurrah for that in her work. So I think, for many respects, Frances Cheviot ought to be like the mascot of this entire conference.
I'm game for that. I love Frances.
Something that I really love about Hare's style that I think lends itself very well to queer romance is that she leads like a lot, like there's like a Wildian like detachment and irony to her books, and like she leaves a lot of space for the reader to fill in. Like she does not do a lot of very deep introspection. Like you're not like deep in like the body of like one of the characters experiencing the world, right? Like it's very like that scene in the garden where like Diana wants Jack to propose to her. It's like you don't need, like, yeah, we hear a little bit of their thoughts or whatever.
Oh no.
Oh, I wanted to hear the rest of that.
hopefully she'll just come back magically. But while we wait for her to magically come back, Kat, sorry.
Sure. So we're talking about like what we like to, what it means to write a queer Regency, right? Like that's, take me back, Sam. Is that the question? Is that the question?
Yes, Rose is back, I
Okay.
think, as well.
Oh, there we go.
Oh.
No.
Yeah. No Rose.
No,
Oh,
Rose,
she's here.
but muted.
Rose, we can't hear you.
Yeah. We'll carry on with your question, Kat. I'll repeat the question I asked, which is basically like, yes, what does it mean to you in your own sort of work to queer hair? What are the challenges, and what is it to sort of queer hair world?
Sure. I mean, well, first I want to start with like, I wouldn't want to write a non-queer hair world. You know what I mean? Like I wouldn't, that has no interest to me at all. And so when I started writing, like my first couple of books were like I deliberately set out to take Georgette Heyer's world and fill it up with queer people. Like I wanted to take this world that I like, populate it with people like me, you know, and call it a day. But it turns out that you really can't do that unless you also unpick the other like the things that underpin her world, right? So like, I don't want to write a book where everybody's rich. So, okay, so now I'm going to write people who have jobs, okay? And I'm going to write people, and since her world is also populated with like people who are like fake disabled or like malingering, right? Or who like, or we have like, you know, noble suffering disabled people. I want to fill it up with people who are realistically disabled. Right? I want to take all of these, all of like the things that denote power and goodness for Georgette Heyer. Like I want to take it and make it so that it feels right to me. Like I want to dismantle what she thought had value and replace it with what I think has value. So that's what, and I think that starts with like, once you start introducing a marginalized group, once you start like centering a marginalized group in stories, like I think that you're naturally also going to look at other marginalized groups, and you're also going to look at like other structures of power. So that is what it means to me to queer hair.
I'd like
Okay, I hope my sound is working again. Is it?
Yes.
Okay. How much of my answer did you guys hear?
Not
Where did
enough.
I get cut off?
I don't remember, Rose.
Okay, because I was talking about Hayer's style and like how she leaves
Yeah.
space for you to fill things in.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
garden
about
scene.
Fluidity and irony.
The
you were
garden
about-
scene. Okay.
Yeah.
Like she's already set up all the emotional stakes, right? And like you just have to, like you can fill in the reactions yourself because you understand the situation, like which she has created very neatly. And I think that's something that I really strive for in my work, is to like not like leave space for the reader to fill things in. And I think that and to leave things like suggested, like very clearly suggested, right? I mean, it's not like subtextual that like, you know, Jack is like upset that he can't ask Diana to marry him, but it's not stated, you know, like it's not like she does, you know, and like I think that has been a sweet spot. And to an extent, I don't want to like revel in it too much, because I think with queer literature, because I think there's also, right, like that's a art form born of necessity where you can't talk about something, so you learn to suggest it. But, and so in a, you know, you also like, it's really great that now we can just talk about it. But when you're writing like a historical romance, like with characters who can't necessarily be super public about, like, I think there's like a lot in her work that stylistically I really love and try to not like emulate directly, but like draw like inspiration or like vibes from.
You once left a note on a manuscript of mine that I was showing what people think, but not how they think. And if I showed how they think, then the reader would keep up better, which sounds like exactly what you're talking about here.
That sounds like something I would say.
Katie, I don't know if you had a response as well to what Kat was talking about with the idea of dismantling those wider structures.
Yeah, it was just that. Okay, a thing that I think that goes often goes quite unacknowledged in your standard heterosexual Regency is just how much of a massive glow up we're already giving to the women. Because I've had, and I'm sure we've all had, people say, oh, well, you know, how can you possibly write a queer Regency because, you know, terrible, everyone was being sent to prison and executed and all this awful oppression that was going on. And using that as a reason not to write these romances. But, you know, we kind of almost take it as read that women get happy endings in these books that they didn't in reality. I mean, if you read The Black Moth, actually, if you read The Black Moth, it's obvious that Tracy is a rapist. And at the end of the book, you know, Jack, the alleged hero, a couple of times basically says, oh, well, you know what he's like. And at the end, they all have this, you know, charming dinner together where he's literally just threatened to rape Diana, and then they sit down and eat together. And actually, you know, there's Regency romance provides this wonderful magical glow around women that give them happy endings, and I find it absolutely baffling that that's accepted as normal, and then giving anyone else a happy ending is some kind of big stretch. Like, you know, okay, if you're actually going to say that you think a governess and a duke is going to have any ending that's good for the governess, then I think everyone else gets a happy ending too, because we're already so far away from reality here. So, you know, just share it about.
Yeah, I think I've said this before, so I apologize. But like, when people want to read about something, they argue that it's historically plausible. And when they don't want to read about it, they argue that it's historically improbable.
Bing, bing. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Thank you so much for this discussion, guys. I'm giving the audience 6 minutes to ask questions. But my question fairies, did you get me some questions? Can you send them to me in the DM? Not on Twitter, on here. Just wait for the question fairies to leap into action.
I quite like the question fairies. Question fairies is a good concept.
Yes. So one of my question fairies found a question. So Mike Hayes, thank you, Frank. Mike Hayes, editor. Oh no. Somebody added one and it disappeared. Mike Hayes' editor have influenced her turn away from the colourfuls of the conservative, from the ambiguous to heteronormative.
Oh, I don't know.
That seems like a question for Jen Kloster. You know, I don't know anything about, like, it seems very possible, but I just don't know anything about it.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't know that closely.
No, that's the same question. How much do you think her early storytelling to her brother still instilled her interest in male characters, because that would be more interesting to her sibling?
I think she was. I'm not sure she was telling any story for her brother. I mean, no. Maybe at the start, but I think she wrote her interests. I think her interests are very clear over about like 40 books. So
I don't remember the question, Vanda, if I'm honest. I don't remember the exact question. I can pop it in the vague ideas. Is that the question that I asked? I can't remember. But the question broadly, Vanda gave us an amazing paper on sort of how colonialism, imperialism appears or works in Hayes' narratives as a sort of a backstory that's not addressed or inquired into. And there was a question that Carrie is going to post to me about colonialism and imperialism and how we write it into these novels.
I mean, I can just say, if you like, it was yes, like,
please.
How should people deal with colonialism and imperialism in writing future Regency romances or Georgian romances? And is there any particularly good examples of this that you think are already out there?
I mean, I'd suggest dealing with it like at all, like, you know what I mean? There's like so much historical fiction in general, not just Regency, you know, implicitly depends on colonialism and on, you know, slavery, exploitation, like the whole, like, you know, the whole package deal of colonialism. And I think acknowledging at all is sort of a bare minimum, and it's a bare minimum that we still don't see. We don't see it even in probably 5% of the books that are out there.
No, I mean, okay, so the first question when I'm writing a Regency, where does my hero's money come from? And isn't that a horrible question to ask yourself? And you sit there, if you're me, contorting yourself to find a way that their money comes from somewhere acceptable. Only money doesn't come from somewhere acceptable, pretty much by definition.
One of the reasons I almost never write rich people, because I just can't deal with it.
No, exactly. It's awful. But as soon as you ask yourself where the money comes from, it's a calamity, basically. And so your options are to think of something clever or not to deal with it, or to, actually, facing up to that reality. But I mean, speaking as a Brit, facing up to that is something that we are really fighting doing as a nation. It's very, very difficult. The National Trust is starting to put things in the big houses that people look around going, this is funded by slavery, this house was built on the profits of slavery, this was built on blood money, and people hate it. They absolutely hate it. If they've come to a nice big Chatsworth to look at the gardens, they don't actually want to look at the fact that this is where it came from. I had the great luck to stay in, it's a landmark trust property, but William Beckford, who wrote Vathek, which is one of the earliest Gothic novels, he built this amazing house, and you can now go and stay in it. And we went to stay in it, and it was amazing. And they've got, they've actually got a whole thing for you to read when you get there about how the Beckford money, which was obscene and huge amounts, and it all came from slavery. And you're sat there saying, well, okay, but now this nice, comfortable house I'm staying in doesn't feel so good. It's not something that we're dealing with nationally at all well, and it's it's incredibly belated that we're starting to. And I think romance fiction is historical romance is going through exactly that same. I don't want to look at it. It was nicer when I didn't have to look at it. Feeling, and I'm afraid that won't do.
I remember hearing once somebody describe historical romance as an escape into privilege.
Yeah.
And it really seems like that's wildly accurate a lot of the times. And there's that 5%, and there's people who are really trying to expand the lens of the window. My God, no. Yeah, push the view farther out. And when that happens, it's really interesting. Courtney Milan has a couple where they're Regency and Victorian romances, but they're involving Chinese characters in China meeting British people, and about the global reach of imperialism at the time. And it's really complex, and it's really interesting. And you can tell that a lot of people are going oh, well, I don't know, this seems like a stretch. And it's just not oh, sorry, I got a little distracted.
I think it's interesting for me because I come from it more of a sort of history and literary scholar point of view. But when people say, oh, well, that wouldn't have happened in the Regency, I'm like, oh, that's much more likely to happen, actually. Which I think is a similar thing, that there's an interesting, it starts with, somebody has already said, it starts with curiosity and interest and finding these stories that very much existed, and bringing them into the world that that Regency romance has created.
Yeah, I do think that's the start of having a wide range of characters, of having the different classes, of having people who. I wrote a book about. There's one guy who is a former enslaved person, and another guy who's a white Brit. And the other guy, he admits he's not particularly politically engaged, but he wouldn't buy slave sugar. And I got dinged by a reviewer who said that it was ridiculous to talk about people boycotting slave sugar because that was a modern thing that people did. Yeah, I know, my head exploded all over. I'm a mess all over the screen. It's where the.
Oh my God.
I know. Being told
boycotts were invented
inaccurate.
in the 80s by Cesar Chavez. Oh my God.
I just
people are ludicrous.
But people really felt that the idea that anyone might have objected to slavery in the sort of in the first decade of the 1800s, it's what do you think people were doing? Yeah, so I think that the resistance isn't just coming from authors who find it difficult to create a fantasy. The resistance is also coming from readers who want to live in an unproblematic fantasy. And I get that, because when we're writing romance, we are writing a fantasy. So it's you know, it's a challenging moral balance that I am in no way sure that I'm handling right.
And it's a question of what you're escaping from. Like, we all know that there's authors out there who've said, oh, I don't write people of color into my books because the stories will never end happily. And it's like, oh, so you're escaping from the reality of non-white people. Great.
Yeah.
It's also who you're writing escape for, right?
Yeah.
Like I think probably the most common question we all get asked is like, why did you decide to write about queer people? You know, and like I've run out of polite ways to answer the question at this point, you know, but like, honestly, I'm writing escape for queer people. Like, that's really what it comes down to. Like, I'm writing escape for people who also think racism is bad. Like, I don't really feel like I should have to explain that as an author. And it gets very like, I want to write escape for people who maybe are like disabled or who aren't white. Like, these are like none of this is so radical. And yet it's the thing that I feel like probably we're all called upon to justify the most often. But like, yes. Anyway.
Yeah. I got I mean, I've spoken about this a few times because it's actually one of the things that, yeah, it's on the identical lines. But I saw an American a Regency author say that basically she never mentioned servants because they were basically appliances. And my grandmother scrubbed floors. My grandmother was an appliance in a big house. And actually, you know what? I actually cannot convey to you how angry I was reading that. I've rarely been so angry in my life. But you know, this is what I think needs. It's no good saying, well, I want my pretty fantasy if your pretty fantasy involves actively harming other people. It's not a pretty fantasy, it's a lie. Sorry, I get very tense.
Yeah, I think a lot about this conversation I saw on a author loop where somebody was writing a hero who was like sneaking into a funeral and robbing the house. Which, like, look, no. Sometimes you got to survive in this world. You know, I was like, okay, you know, let's hear more. Yeah. And then someone was like, but he's a gentleman in disguise, right? Or like, he's like a gentleman who's like fallen into poverty. And the author was like, oh yeah, he's not just some guy off the street. Like, of course he's a gentleman. And my head exploded. Like, so the fact that he doesn't want to get a job, so he's stealing from a family at the funeral of a family member who might have been his friend in like another, is somehow better than if he like was born in like a thieving community and like was trained as a thief professionally. Yeah, like I can't, like I just can't even.
Alexis Hall had something on Twitter the other day where he said he was reading about a YA book where the hero was a body snatcher. I think it was a body snatcher. And he just imagined this conversation with the romance publisher where you go, the hero's a body snatcher, and they go, okay, but can he be a duke who's a body snatcher? And I just thought, yeah, that sounds about right.
Honestly, I would maybe read that book though.
Yeah, I mean, totally, we all read that book,
right? But why, like, I'm so curious, why is the Duke a body snatcher?
Yeah, well, for the same reason that the Duke is a spy and the Duke is a rat catcher and the Duke is all these things. I mean, it's amazing the jobs the Dukes had.
Wait, is there actually a book where the Duke is a rat catcher?
Yes. Oh my God! It's called The Proposition by Judith Ivory, and I really want you to watch out for this. It's trigger warnings ahoy!
I can't do.
No, don't. It's trigger warnings up the jacksie. It's really, really problematic. It's very beloved. It's a Pygmalion book where the heroine's supposed to be a philologist, and she takes on this guy who's supposed to be Cockney Cornwall, and the author attempts to reproduce a Cockney Cornwall dialect on page.
Oh, no.
which is
Wait, what is
actually-
Cockney Cornwall? I thought that is
Cockney Cornwall isn't a thing, and if
Okay,
you read what's
okay,
on
thank
page
you,
with a British
good.
accent, your eyes start to bleed like literal blood. And then the hero is basically just this really grotesque groomer and abuser, and then at the end of all of it, you've got this whole thing whereby he's a rat catcher, but he turns out to be just as good as any duke, and then it turns out he is a duke. And it's just one of those books where you just sit there going, you know what, I will never get this time back, and also my genome has literally deteriorated just while reading this.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's definitely interesting. The kind of it has to be a duke in disguise. It's so interesting to me because it's such an 18th century trope.
Yeah.
Like, don't worry, guys. He's rich.
He's noble.
Yeah.
It's not even rich, it's titled as well.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. It's the kind of old blood logic.
Yeah, he's got the blood, therefore it's fine. Which is just, yeah, so.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up because that's the end of our time for the panel. It's been so much fun. Really, really enjoyed the discussion with you all. Thank you to everybody who came in and listened as well. If you did, if you're like, oh man, I don't want to keep listening to these guys talking about this topic because it's great. Do check out the playlist. We did individual interviews before the what's this called? Conference with each of our writers, including Zencho. Zencho was able to come to that. So I'm sure one of my question fairies has popped it in the chat for you. So do have a look at those videos and sort of the wider discussion as well. So I'm going to stop recording. Boop.